Today, the defense rested in the case of the trial of George Zimmerman, who is charged with second-degree murder in the killing of Trayvon Martin. The prosecution's closing argument will be tomorrow, and the defense's will be on Friday. Mr. Zimmerman has pleaded not guilty, claiming self-defense. And we learned at day's end that the defendant will not take the stand. Just a few hours before, an obligatory set of questions from Judge Deborah Nelson turned into a tense exchange.
And have you made a decision, sir, as to whether or not you want to testify in this case?
I object to that question.
Okay, overruled. Have you made a decision as to whether or not you want to testify in the case?
I object to that question. I think that's Mr.
Overruled. The court is entitled to inquire of Mr. Zimmerman's determination as to whether or not he wants to testify. Mr. Zimmerman, have you made a decision as to whether or not you want to testify in this case?
No, not at this time.
Okay.
I object to the court inquiring of Mr. Zimmerman as to his decision about whether or not to testify.
Your objection is overruled.
The trial truly entered its final act today, including both the defense and prosecution's use of a life-size pliable foam dummy while questioning Dennis Root, a former law enforcement officer. Mr. Root was called by the defense as an expert on the use of force. The final witness for the defense was the defendant's father, George Zimmerman Sr., testifying the screams for help on the 911 tape were his son. But outside the courtroom, another narrative has been developing. A right-wing trope about the specter of racial violence. Here's part of Bill O'Reilly's Talking Points memo from last night.
Even among African Americans themselves, blacks come out as the top racist group. 31% of black Americans say their own race heads the list. The only thing the American press will embrace is the specter of oppression. That is, if a white American kills a black American or any other minority, then the story gets covered. There's no question the Zimmerman trial is now a racial deal rather than a justice deal. And if George Zimmerman is acquitted by a jury of 5 white women and a Hispanic lady, there will be racial animus.
It's a pernicious planting of the expectation of racial violence, just as the right-wing website Breitbart.com blared a headline, Broward County Sheriff's Office prepares Zimmerman verdict riot plan, based upon what would commonly be considered responsible preparations for a high-profile televised trial. Joining me now is Jelani Cobb, Associate Professor of History, Director of the Institute for African American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Jelani, it's great to have you here. Good. So here's what angers me genuinely about this, is what conservatives are doing to black people writ large is precisely what George Zimmerman did to Trayvon Martin.
That's right.
It is that they are suspected of being disposed to violence in some kind of preternatural way more than other races. Mm-hmm. They are judged guilty before they do anything.
Yeah, I think it would be a marvelous bit of irony if they were that clever. And also, I should just say really quickly about the graphic about 31% of African Americans believing that our own group is the most racist. That poll was done by the same people who brought you President Romney.
Right. Yes.
And so that shows you the reliability of of this. But I think that they are trafficking in the same idea, and I think in some ways it makes perfect sense, because we wouldn't be here were it not for the laws, and the laws that really are predicated upon this sense of fear of criminals, and specifically black and brown people.
What do you mean by that?
And so when we look at Mr. Zimmerman, who's been obviously the emphasis that people have had here for good reason. But how do we get to this situation? This is a product, in the same way that maybe Newtown is a product of these liberalizing gun laws.
Right.
We don't get to the situation with Trayvon Martin without stand your ground. Right. It's a natural byproduct of having laws that really make proactive self-defense. And so when we're looking at how we got here, we're saying, well, the NRA created this culture of fear, tapped into this culture of fear, and now we don't know whether or not it's actually legal to.
That's right. It's the same fear. It's so clear. I mean, you see it every day on Fox. You see it on the Drudge Report. It's this preternatural ability to kind of reach into the deepest brainstem activity of the fear impulse. And it's the same thing that drives the NRA. It's this kind of paranoid vision, particularly of the moment when racial violence happens, when Nat Turner is at your door, right? That is the thing that is being tapped into, even in preparation even though the fact that George Zimmerman is on trial is the product of an incredibly disciplined, totally nonviolent protest movement that happened down in Florida.
Yeah, absolutely. And the specter of violence is even more shocking, considering the fact that people, when they first saw this, there were 44 days in which people didn't believe there'd be any arrest.
Right.
And
there was no specter of justice.
There was no belief. And the other thing here is that riots and unrest tend to happen when people expect one outcome and they get something else. I don't think people expect for there to be a conviction in this case, or people are at least prepared to accept the idea or recognize the idea that there may well be an acquittal.
I think people have kind of priced that in,
right,
as it were. Jelani Cobb from the University of Connecticut. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Walmart's about to get into a smackdown with Washington, D.C. I'll explain next.